So this is the conscience, week 2. And I just want to review because this is an idea that I kind of want to slowly get into your head. It might feel repetitive, but I think people struggle with getting at what I'm saying, so I kind of want to be a little bit specific. So what does weak mean? One idea is theological immaturity. Okay. So maybe someone says, I can't have a bottle of wine in my house. And somebody else says, well, the Bible doesn't say that. Right? You're being immature. The person there has only told you the end of the conversation, or the end of the conviction that he has. He hasn't told you why he's concluded that he can't have a bottle of wine. But nevertheless, let's say he has a biblical principle, and based on that, he has made an application, he's applied it, and he's concluded, I can't do X. Okay. You might say, we might say he's weak, and I would agree he's weak, but the question is, where is his weakness? What about him is weak? And some would say he's weak in his understanding of Bible principles and in how to apply them. Okay? That's very common. Immaturity essentially is saying that he's immature in his understanding of biblical principles or in his ability to apply them. And just to be clear, I say no. That is actually not what weak means for Paul. Number 2, the tendency to violate your own convictions. Okay, we all have a tendency to go back on our convictions and give in and do what we know we shouldn't do, what we should not do. And maybe that tendency to fall is what it means to be weak. That means that weakness is the tendency to go back on your own applications of biblical principles. This is kind of appealing because in the passage that we read last week, and all of Romans 14 and first part of 15, it's the weak who are inclined to stumble, and we have to worry that we don't make them stumble. But again, no, this is not what I believe weak means. It's often the case for the weak, but I don't think that's what it means to be weak. So my definition is simply the inability in conscience to do something. So you have a Bible principle, you apply it, and you say, I can't do X. So just as an example, let's say I'm having a conversation with my friend Brian, and Brian says, my neighbor's dog keeps pooping on my lawn, and I hate it. And I said, well, did you ask him to tie the dog up, when he puts him outside? Yeah, lots of times. It's so aggravating. I hope you don't really have this problem, right? And I said, well, Brian, I got a solution. Next time the dog comes over, just shoot it. Okay. So Brian is going to say what's in that last red box. I can't do that. I hope that's what he says. Brian has just expressed inability. He said, I can't do that. But what does that mean, inability? I mean, I'm pretty sure he has a gun, and I'm pretty sure he actually knows how to shoot it and actually is able to do it. So why did he say I can't when he can? That's not true. And And I hope the reason is that he feels morally unable to shoot that dog, right? So I define weakness as the conviction that you cannot do something. And it can be something that's also illegal, just to clarify. You would get also in trouble if you shot the neighbor's dog. It's not, it's illegal. It's not just, but beyond that, I hope your conscience would bother you about that. So what else might we be morally unable to do? What about Game of Thrones? We had this on the survey. I don't know, 27 of you, I think, took the online questionnaire, so thanks for that. What's that? Nothing? Yeah, that's pretty good. And we'll go over that in a little bit, but so John Piper gives an answer at Ask Pastor John. There's one of the episodes is, should Christians watch Game of Thrones? And he says no, a Christian cannot watch this. We'll talk about his answer in a little bit. Kevin DeYoung wrote an article for T4G a few years ago, and he said no Christian should watch Game of Thrones. He got a little bit of flack for that. People said he was binding the conscience. I think we defined this last week. Binding the conscience is essentially to use human force to say, thus says the Lord, when God didn't necessarily say that thing, okay? So he wrote a second paper for T4G again, defending his original position. This one that I've put up one more time on Game of Thrones is the second one. So if you're interested in that, you can Google that. Okay, so in our questionnaire, so this is us. 10 people said, I don't know. That's the purple. So I don't know if you can read it there, but the bottom purple is, I don't know enough about Game of Thrones to have an opinion. So that was 10 people out of 26 responses. 4 of you said it was fine. So I'm a little surprised at that. One of our elders came to me after Sunday school last week and said, I don't really think Game of Thrones is a good example for Romans 14 because I think Game of Thrones is just wrong. So the 4 of you who said it's fine, I don't want to bind your conscience, but I do want to try. I would recommend Piper's article. He gives 12 reasons why the answer is no. I'm not going to go over the 12 because this class is not about Game of Thrones. This class is not about whether Game of Thrones is okay. This is about developing a framework in your mind so that you can properly evaluate something like Game of Thrones. It's about how to train your conscience and how to interact with others when they don't agree. So for this class, I want to focus on Piper's 12th reason. Reason number 12. If you doubt, don't. There's one biblical guideline that makes life very simple. Whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from sin. Is not from faith. For whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. Romans 14:23. My paraphrase. This is still Piper talking. My paraphrase. If you doubt, don't. That would alter the viewing habits of millions, and oh, how sweetly they would sleep with their conscience. Okay, so look closely at what Piper is saying. Not his conclusion, but how he's getting there. He's using Romans 14. Okay, I think I underlined that for you. Yep. Remember, this is about weak brothers who doubt that they could do things. But it's not just any kind of doubt. It's verse 22 tells the strong to keep their faith to themselves. So we don't normally keep our faith to ourselves. We normally share our faith. But this type of faith we keep to ourselves. So the faith versus doubt in Romans 14 is about whether one believes he can do something. Second thing, Piper is encouraging us to doubt that we can watch Game of Thrones. That was kind of mainly the first 11 reasons, which I haven't included. But he's encouraging doubt in the Romans 14 sense. To doubt in the Romans 14 sense is essentially to judge that you can't do something. So he's not just saying if you doubt, he's saying you really should doubt on this. You really should be the weak brother. He didn't say that last part. I wish he had. It would have been perfect. And on that basis, he says, don't watch it. And then your conscience will be at rest. So implicitly, Piper is saying that Romans 14 doubt is a good, healthy Christian thing. Piper is using this passage as a call to doubt, and implicitly I say, and I go on to say, as a call to be weak. You should say, if you say I can't watch Game of Thrones, you could also say I am weak to watch Game of Thrones. Same meaning. Part of the reason I included this example is, as Pastor Jeff introduced the Sunday school last week, he mentioned that I take a novel view of this passage, which is true. But there are a lot of usages of it, like Piper's here, that really require my view to make sense. So let's go back to how you all thought about Game of Thrones. 12 of you said it's sinful. That's these 3 sections here, okay? But in 3 different ways. 6 said it's sinful. That's a very simple answer. That's the blue one. 3 of you said it's sinful, but not inherently sinful. So you 3 understood some difference in the word inherently. And 3 said it's sinful, but I'm not really sure whether it's inherently sinful or not. So as a class, we think Game of Thrones is sinful, but we're not sure whether it's inherently sinful. So let's go back to Romans 14 and talk through some more of that. I asked you last week on the survey, what is the main theme of Romans 14, 10 through 15, 13? And you said, here's some of your answers. Unity, live in harmony, don't judge, don't cause your brother to stumble, sacrificial love gives up rights, it's exhortations to the strong, and pursue peace. Lots of good answers there. Good job. I'm going to say the main point of this section is, for the sake of love, strong believers must sometimes give up their rights. All right? I'll show you. So here's the passage. I'm going to read little parts of it. So if you have your Bible open, or if you can, is that legible when it's this size? Can most of you read that? Brian, can you read that? Verse 13, decide never to put a stumbling block. Stumbling means being tripped so that you fall into sin. That's what stumbling means. So, be careful what you eat. Verse 15, if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you're no longer walking in love. So be careful what you eat. By what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. So be careful what you eat. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone who makes another stumble by what he eats. You know, how would that be? If you destroyed God's work in your brother, and why did you do that? For the sake of some barbecue. How horrible, right? Don't do that. Be careful what you eat. By the way, if you're wondering what destroyed means, we're not going to do this, but if you go back in old archives, John Piper does, I think, a really good job of explaining how destroyed means to utterly destroy. That there's a lot on the line here for your brother. So be careful what you eat. Let's see, where are we? Verse 21. It is good not to eat meat or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. So be careful what you eat. Verse 22. Blessed is the one who has no reason to judge himself for that which he approves. So if your brother approves something by joining you and then he has to judge himself, he's not too happy anymore. So be careful what you eat. Whoever doubts is condemned if he eats. So be careful what you eat. And chapter 15, verse 1, we who are strong have an obligation to, I think I'm behind by one click. We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not please ourselves. So be careful what you eat.
The failings of the weak.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about failings. Just I promised we would, and we will. So the what gets repeated here in meaning is be careful what you eat, be careful what you eat, be careful what you eat. So do you have a sense of what Paul was hoping would happen in this Roman church? The theme of the first part that we looked at last week, verses 1 through 9, was how and why the Roman believers differed. And the theme of this is, in order for you to love your brother, you got to give up your rights and be careful sometimes not to eat meat with them.
That'd be the strong.
The strong need to, yep.
Submit to the failings of the weak.
Well, they need to, yeah, we'll talk about, just give me a moment. Why do you have to do this? Because your weak brother is in danger. What kind of danger? Okay. All right, let's go through this passage. This is going to be quick, but let's look at a couple of the dangers. Verse 15 is number 1. For if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy. Grieved is the sadness of guilt. Okay? And also it can destroy them. We're not going to go into that. So when we're talking about grieved, listen to, just to think this through, listen to 2 Corinthians 7, 8 through 9. For even if I made you grieve with my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, for I see that the letter grieved you, though only for a while. As it is, I rejoice, not because you were grieved, but because you were grieved into repenting. For you felt a godly grief, so that you suffered no loss through us. For godly grief produces repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death. So this might seem a little inconsistent, right? In Romans, Paul says, don't make your brother grieved. It could destroy him. And then here he's saying, I made you grieve, and I'm glad I did. So in this little box, I have kind of these two things that are necessary for grief. One is doing X, and then the second is knowing that X is sinful. In the case of the Corinthians, they were already doing X, which could be a couple different things. If you read through 1 Corinthians, there's several things they were doing that were pretty bad. And then Paul came along and told them that it was sinful, and that's what gave them grief. And what he's talking about in Romans is the opposite. Your brother already knows that X is sinful, and Paul, what the situation Paul's talking about is whether you would encourage him then to do it. So do you see why they're different? So there are more expressions, if you read through more of chapter 14, stating that it's sinful for the weak brother to eat meat or to do what his conscience forbids, but I'm not going to list them all. Okay, danger number 2.
But could the grieved also be relating partly to the earlier encouragement not to condemn the strong brother that you said? That the weak brother is in fact looking at the person who's eating meat saying, what a sinful person.
Yeah, I think we'll get there in a little bit. Yep.
It could have that sense too. It's not just grief.
Well, okay, so danger number 2, though, is do not let what you regard as good be spoken of as evil. The word here, spoken of as evil, is blasphemy. So why does Paul use such a powerful word as blasphemy? Meat for the strong is good. Okay? Everything good is a gift from God. So for the weak brother to call meat evil is to call God the giver of evil gifts. And you don't want to be calling God the giver of evil gifts. That's blasphemy. God doesn't give evil gifts, he gives good gifts. So in some sense, and we'll refine this a little bit, it is evil to call these things evil. Okay, let me point out one non-danger for the weak brother. And that is that he might be offended. The way that this came into our thinking is through King James English, I think, and then a change in the understanding of what a word means between 1611 and now. If you have a King James Version, verse 21 will say that we must not make a brother stumble or be offended. And the word offended, the same word that's translated offended, shows up elsewhere in Romans 14, so it's not simply that verse. The way this comes out in our lives is statements like this: stop playing that music, it offends me. Or don't drink beer in front of me, that offends me. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, Steve. Is that right?
Sure.
And I'm saying that is a modern meaning for offense that Paul never meant. Offended in the King James Version did not mean that either. It didn't mean you bother me. It meant fall into sin. To be offended is to be encouraged to do something that you consider sin and then fall into the sin of doing that thing. Okay? So you do not have the right, and this might be a new idea, I don't know, we'll see. You do not have the right to be bothered by your friend's strength. You actually need to rejoice in it. Now, that doesn't change the fact that you might be bothered by it, right? And because you're of the state where you're bothered by it, it might cause your, the way you're bothered might cause you to say something like, that offends me, which kind of is stepping into that blasphemy thought process where you're saying, that thing you're doing is bad, and I'm labeling it as bad. So your duty is to rejoice in it. When he says, don't let your good be evil spoken of, or spoken of as evil, as the ESV puts it, what he's saying is know your brother, know if he has a tendency to this sin of blasphemy over this thing, and if so, you probably need to not have the beer around him. Okay? But that does not justify his statement of saying it bothers me. It's a bad thing to say. Have I made that make sense?
So it's not the same as earlier passing judgment. Being grieved is not the same. Or it is. It's exactly the same when it's in verse 3 when it says pass judgment on the one who eats.
Well, being grieved is passing judgment on yourself and feeling the guilt of personal sin. Being grieved is being sorrowful and having regret about what you did. Okay, so it's time for failings. Let's look at Romans 15:1. Which says, we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Okay, so I'm going to say the ESV translation here is not great. First, the word failings. NASB does better. NASB translates it as weaknesses. This is the Greek word. Right? The word has the same root as the weak person in 14:1. The weak person in 14:1 that we're supposed to welcome is astheno, and this is anesthenity. So literally, when NASB is making it the weaknesses of those without strength, he's making it the weaknesses of the weak. So the reason I say this is way better is that it shows in English how the word weakness, which is a pretty important word in this passage, is reflected in this verse. To make it failings actually kind of changes its possible meanings and hides its relationship with the weak person. Did that make sense?
So it would be their traditional view of the editors that made them translate that to failings.
Yeah, I think I can't remember. I don't know. I'm not going to talk about what their reasoning
That
is.
seems to be the case, wouldn't it?
It could be. It could be.
So context would tell us how translation should be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Their context. I mean.
So the next is bear with. ESV says that we have an obligation to bear with the weaknesses of the weak. NASB says the strong ought to bear the weaknesses of the weak. Okay, what's the difference? They're very close, bear and bear with. In English, bear with means to tolerate, and bear means to carry. So I could have we could be on a hike, and I have a heavy backpack, and I might say, I am bearing with this backpack. And you mean, and I mean I'm tolerating it. Or I could say I am bearing this backpack, which means I'm carrying it. It's a different meaning. And the Greek word here means to pick up and carry. It does not mean to tolerate. Although you're going to have to tolerate it, just like the backpack. It is something to tolerate. But the point here is to pick up and carry. And the reason that's important is because what Paul is saying here, essentially, is that a weakness is something that the strong can take on. Right? So if you go back maybe to the very beginning slides where I had those different reasons why that person could be weak. What does weak mean? Is it his inability to think well about the Christian faith? That's kind of the traditional thought. I don't think Paul would be saying, this guy doesn't think well, so I want you to take on his poor thinking. Now, maybe I'm being very picky about words because I think Paul is saying, take on his inability. He does the same thing in 1 Corinthians 9 where he's talking about to this person, to the Jew I act as a Jew, to the Gentile I act as a Gentile. But then when it comes to weak, he says, to the weak, I am weak. And I think what he's saying is, I'm literally unable, for a different reason that he has, but I take on his inability. So if someone can't do something, then I don't do that thing around them. Does that make sense? Okay, last translation point is kind of important to me, so I'll mention it. I don't know whether it'll come up again, but the ESV renders this the failings of the weak, and technically this is not the word weak. This is a negation of its antonym. So NASB is, again, being very precise in making it those without strength. It literally is the non-strength. Okay?
So you're saying it's a double negative?
Yes. Yep, it kind of is. Or, no, it's just a negative. It's not a double negative because there's a word for weak, astheno, and then there's a word for strong, which is dunamai, which actually most of the time means able. And if you put not in front of it, it's unable or unstrong. Okay. And so it's important to me, and I don't know whether we'll get into this sort of thing, but it's important to me that weak is actually a synonym of unstrong or not strong. But I don't know whether we'll get there. We'll see. The reason I pointed out this last one is to show that Paul had a conception of a weak, strong framework. And in that framework, weak and strong are opposites. Okay. In the end, what this verse is telling us is when you're strong, pick up and carry the weaknesses of the non-strong instead of pleasing yourself. Take them on. He can't have meat, then you can't have meat. It doesn't mean you have the same thinking he has. You actually are not having the meat for a very different reason that he's not having the meat. But you also can't have it. All right, there's one more verse I want to look at in today's passage, which is verse 14, chapter 14, verse 14. So remember, the main point of 14:10 through 15:13 is what? What was it? Be careful what you eat. Yep. Don't use your strength if it hurts your weak brother. Inside that section, we find Romans 14:14, which says, I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean of itself. And he means nothing of the type of thing we're talking about. Okay. But it is unclean for anyone who thinks it unclean. So I said this is one of those verses that people point to, and Paul makes a very adamant statement. I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean of itself. And people want to say, right there, Paul is saying, the weak brother is wrong. Okay. And I don't think that's exactly true. We can divide this into 14a and 14b, and I'll just refer to them as that. But I want to show you two things about this verse. One is that 14b is the main point of the verse, which might be surprising to you because 14a has this know and persuade in the Lord Jesus. It sounds very adamant. But that's number one. 14b is the main point of this verse. Number two is that here in this verse, Paul respected the thinking of the weak. All right, so first, which of these is the main point? And I would point to this question, which of these is logically connected to the main theme of the section that it's in? So remember what the main theme was, right? Be careful what you eat. And remember why they have to be careful. Why do they have to be careful? Go ahead and answer.
So that your good will not be evil spoken of.
Yes, so that they won't commit blasphemy. The weak won't commit blasphemy. And what else? Yes, so they don't end up with the grief of sin, of having participated. In the context, the point of 14b is that it's unclean for the one who thinks it's unclean. Otherwise, it's not sin for him to fall into it. Does that make sense? The point of this whole section is that the weak brother is exposed to danger. He might fall into sin, right? And this verse, this 14b, is written to establish that sinful danger. It is sinful for anyone who thinks it is sinful. I'm using sinful as a synonym for unclean. We won't have time to talk about why, but hopefully that's...
So if they have a change of heart later, does it become clean then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, if they change their mind later, does it become unclean? We will answer that in what time is it? In about 6 minutes. Okay, so real quick, there's, this word thinks. All right, now we have the weak brother thinking it's unclean. What does that word thinks mean? There's two Greek words that Paul could have chosen for thinks. The first is dokeo. And here's three passages where we find this word. Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant, right? They misunderstood. Whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. And the third is, if anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not know as he ought to know, is the rest. The point is, dokeo means to suppose, or to imagine, or to think hastily. Okay. There is another word for think, which is logizomai. It's where we get our word logic, actually. I don't know if you can see logic in that, but here's a couple comments on the meaning of logizomai. Most of the time in Romans, when it says reckon, it's logizomai. Okay. Kittel said it is to deliberate, to conclude. Especially in Plato, it is the term for the non-emotional thinking of the philosopher seeking superpersonal knowledge. In other words, there's truth out there and I'm trying to find it. So I'm going to really think about how to find that knowledge. In this case, the receptive apprehension of something objectively present. Okay. Here's two commentators who discuss what it means. Moule, who is a Greek grammarian, also wrote, "Such was to be the condition for the true play of the inner life. These hearts and thoughts are to be active, discursive, reflecting, reckoning." He puts reckoning in quotes because in our Bible it is reckoning a lot. Calculating. Calculating is in quotes because it's used for accounting and math. You reckon and account. You figure out how much the person has, or you figure out how much the person owes. It is a calculation, and it's supposed to be careful and correct. Reasoning out is another way to describe it. Logiste. These things think out, reckon, reason on. Now, Moule wrote this in his commentary about Philippians 4:8, which says, "Whatsoever things are just, lovely, all these things, think on these things." So he's talking about thinking that should end up controlling the way you live, not just thinking. And Barnes says the same thing: careful attention and study, think. There's actually several about Philippians 4:8 that really describe thinking in an incredibly positive way. I couldn't give you, well, okay, so until 4 months ago, I couldn't give you a commentator who of Romans who talks about the word logizomai and explains it. I have looked at 38 commentaries, and none of them examine the word logizomai for thinks. It's pretty typical that you find, like Cranfield, which I think is a very good commentary, goes through every single word, every single Greek word in verse 14a, and talks about what it means and what its impact is. And then on 14b, he examines 0 Greek words, and he simply says, "The weak thinks wrongly." Okay, and that's very common. The amount of attention given to 14a is way more than 14b. And I don't think that should be the case, because I think 14b is actually, in context, the point Paul is really wanting to make.
Is it a grand conspiracy?
No. No. So, for verse 14, thinks is logizomai. So Paul chose the careful, logical, deliberate, calculating, truth-seeking word for thinking when he's talking about what the weak brother is doing. He could have used dokeo, he could have said hastily thinks or supposes, but he didn't. There are, yes. Paul is pointing out 2 ways that something can be wrong. First, in itself. Okay? And Paul is saying for these type of things, they're not wrong in themselves. Now, some things are wrong in themselves. Paul doesn't literally mean nothing's wrong in itself. There are things God has explicitly said, don't do this. Okay? So something can be wrong in itself, and it can be wrong for the one who thinks. We're going to use this way of speaking throughout the next 6 weeks. In itself means the Bible has explicitly forbidden something. For you, or for him, or for the individual, or for her, means that the thing itself is not forbidden, but there are principles that they've applied to it. They have thought, and I mean logically, deliberately, biblically thought about applying those principles, and they've concluded that it's wrong. And so it is wrong for them, not universally, but for them. Okay? which means that the weak brother actually has a difficult job, in some ways more difficult than the strong, because he has to simultaneously embrace two things. One is that the meat is clean in itself, and second is that it's unclean for him. All right, so that's kind of the end of Romans 14. We're going to spend a few minutes and go through principles from Romans 14. So first, a little caution. We're only one passage into talking about conscience, so we're going to have to refine some of the things that we say. In the questionnaire, I put a place for you to have questions and make responses. And one person wrote, what about biblically clear sin? But someone doesn't agree it's sinful. What then? And someone else wrote about, like, what are the limits here? Because this seems kind of dangerous. So we do have more passages to consider before we have a full view, but let's look at a few principles. Principle one is welcome one another, but not for the purpose of arguing about opinions. All right? So arguments about can you eat meat wasn't the point that Paul wanted them to get together for. Second principle is this dual origins of convictions, right? Which is your mind. Paul says, think in your mind. He says, be logical, reason through these things. If you reason you can't do it, then you can't. Be fully persuaded in your mind. But then he also says that Jesus is Lord of the conscience, and he can change your conscience. So this no doubt raises some questions in your mind. You know, what sort of things can people claim? You know, Jesus told me this, and then I have to respect it. And how do we balance these? Is it like 50% your mind and 50% Jesus, or how does that work? Hopefully that box has you itching for further weeks. All right, so I think we have time to go through duties of weak brother and duties of strong brother. Okay, both, it's small. Maybe you can read it, maybe you can't. So for the weak, study the word, apply it, be persuaded in your mind. For the strong, study the word, use your mind, think about how the word applies to your life. 2, the weak thanks God for his conviction. The strong thanks God for his freedom. This is from Romans 14, 5 and 6. Both need to thank God. Next, accept that you're weak. It's not an insult, right? We think of weak as an insult. I mean, we think it'd be really strange to say, okay, you're a weak brother. But, okay, think about this. Paul wrote to this Roman church. It's a place that he had not personally been, I don't think, at this point. And he labeled half of them as weak. You know, have fun reading that. I don't think he expected them to be insulted by it. So accept that you're weak. If you are, it's not an insult. It simply means you can't do something. And if you're strong, don't think you're better than others. Okay, for the next one, let's look at our responses on issue number 3. Okay, if you didn't do the questionnaire, let me read what's in the top that Google put in is just it's a cut down version. Let me read the whole thing. A friend told me, and this is a true story. It wasn't told to me. It's from a book on, it's from a sermon actually on Romans 14. A friend told me, I don't have social media anymore. I asked why. He said, well, I don't do it because I found that I would get up every morning and look at that and not read my Bible. And so I made up my mind, I'm not going to have that anymore. I'm not. And he says, you know, everybody else, I'm not judging other people. That's just for me. Okay? So I gave 4 responses that you could have to this. Response A, that's the blue one, is there's nothing wrong with social media. This guy is wrong. Okay? No, none of you chose that. And D is the green one at the bottom, which is he's right. Nobody should have social media. That's actually kind of the one I like the best. But But A and D have one thing in common, and that is that they both universalize the answer to this question. Do you see that? A says, there's nothing wrong with social media. This guy is wrong. In other words, the answer to the general question, should we have social media? There is an answer. There's a universal answer. That's what the blue says. There's a universal answer, and this guy got it wrong. And so he should not be saying that his not having social media is his way of serving Jesus. Okay? And D says, no, he's right, and there's only one answer. We know there's only one answer because we're universalist thinking. And so really, he's right, and everyone should follow him and delete Facebook. It's hard not to recommend that one. But I think it's great that no one selected those. You can see there's no green or blue. Response B is, social media is not wrong, but this guy wrongly believes it's wrong, so he should avoid it. Okay? And then C is, social media isn't wrong, but he rightly, in my opinion, believes it's wrong, so he should avoid it. Now, the majority of you said that he was right. The majority of you went with this, with C, which is that social media is not wrong, but he rightly is avoiding it. He rightly believes it's wrong, so he should avoid it.
Did you mean rightly believes it's wrong or rightly avoids it? That could be confusing.
Well, it says so. What it says is he rightly believes it's wrong, so he should. He has an ought to avoid it. It's both.
Right.
Well, okay,
So that would be.
we're out of time, rats. 5 of you said that he was wrong. Raise your hand if you said he wrongly believes it's wrong. Okay, why did you say wrongly believes he's wrong?
Because it's not wrong for everyone universally.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And really because I didn't have another option that was like the best option.
So this is a true story. It's expressed the way that it was expressed to this pastor who was relating it. I really believe he was quoting this guy. And one thing I want to point out here is that we won't get to the rest of the duties. That's okay. But let me finish this little part. This guy, I think, is struggling to express himself in a clear way. And why is that? I think the reason is that we have misunderstood weakness. There is a biblical word for what he's doing. He's weak. But he doesn't know that word because nobody thinks of weak in that way. If I say to him, oh, you're a weak brother, he's going to go, I think you think I'm wrong now, right? Or if he said, I'm a weak brother on this issue, so I only hold that it's wrong for me. Social media is fine in itself. I don't judge other people. Okay, now you know, maybe you think that would be a more clickable answer. Well, if he's saying, I'm a weak brother on this issue, I only hold that it's wrong for me. Of itself, it's fine. I don't judge others. If he said that, I think you know that he doesn't think it's universally wrong, even though clearly he says, I don't judge others, it's just me. He was trying to say that. But you didn't think he really said it. And I think the reason is because we've lost this word weak that we should not have lost. So I also wanted today to go through like Hebrews 12:1. You know, we're called to lay aside weights. And maybe this guy says, for me, it's Hebrews 12:1. Social media is not sinful, but for me, it's a weight that slows me down. And I had to get rid of that in order to run my race for Jesus, okay? I don't think any of us would look at him and go, well, you need to download Facebook because you're just wrong to think that that's what God wanted you to do, right? So we need this concept that someone can grasp for themselves a conviction that's not universal. And I think that's what this passage is about. Well, The next, we're gonna be done here. The next one is if Jesus wants to change your mind, he can. And I think that's what you were getting at, is on either side of this. I would hope that in that little blurb that we talked about social media, maybe some of you are sitting there thinking, okay, when I think about weights and what slows me down, actually it's Facebook. I scroll on Facebook and it wastes my time. And maybe you say, okay, I'm convicted. I would say that is your conscience telling you, you are weak. You need to submit to the Lord in this thing and get rid of it. Maybe. Again, you can't bind the consciences of others, but I sure want to try. So when I say this one in response to you, that Jesus can change your conscience, I mean that, but I mean it either way. He could, if you're weak, he could change you and make you strong later and make you able to have Facebook. And on the other hand, maybe he challenges you, he convicts you to adopt a conviction. So we better stop there, even though there's more. Yes?
Paul is a prime example of that. We see Paul as the Pharisee persecuting the Christians, and he would have been following that Jewish